Imagine you're standing in a factory in Sandusky, Ohio. It's 2002. You've worked here for 30 years making crayons and pencils. Your father worked here before you. You know every machine, every rhythm, every sound this place makes. The company just called you into the break room. The manager clears his throat. They're moving everything to Mexico, he says. But here's the part that makes your blood freeze. They need you to train your replacement. Mexican workers are flying in next week. You'll spend your final months teaching them how to operate the machines you've run for 3 decades. Then you'll be laid off. Roger Bibler, the union president, watched grown men cry. One employee had been there 51 years. He walked out for the last time sobbing like a child. Most workers refused to train their replacements. How could they? But a few did, knowing they had families to feed and needed every last paycheck. Here's the cruel punchline. The pencils you made? They're still in every American school. Same yellow Dixon Ticonderoga No. 2 pencils kids use for standardized tests. Still required supplies in classrooms across the country. Still sold at Walmart and Target. They just don't say made in America anymore. And the factory in Mexico that replaced you? It went bankrupt a few years later anyway. This is the story nobody tells you about free trade. Not the economists with their charts showing rising GDP. Not the politicians promising prosperity for all. Not the corporate executives celebrating record profits. This is about the actual human cost paid in full by people who never got a vote. Welcome to the hidden price tag of free trade agreements. And buckle up because it gets so much worse than you think. Let's rewind to the early 1990s. Enthusiasm for globalization is at fever pitch. The Berlin Wall has fallen. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Francis Fukuyama has declared the end of history. Free market capitalism has won, and now it's time to spread the gospel worldwide. Enter NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Signed in 1993 by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The promise was intoxicating, almost religious in its certainty. Remove trade barriers. Let goods flow freely across borders. Everyone specializes in what they do best. Prices drop. Selection expands. Prosperity rains down like manna from heaven. President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and declared it would create hundreds of thousands of American jobs. He called it a win-win-win for all 3 countries. Ross Perot, the quirky billionaire running for president, stood at a debate podium and warned about a giant sucking sound of jobs heading south. People laughed at him. The experts knew better. The experts were catastrophically wrong. Let's talk numbers. According to the Economic Policy Institute, NAFTA eliminated roughly 879,000 U.S. jobs between 1993 and 2002. That's not job displacement, that's not creative destruction, that's nearly 1 million people whose lives got upended. Michigan lost 168,000 manufacturing jobs. Ohio hemorrhaged positions. North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, every Rust Belt state has towns that look like bomb sites. But raw statistics don't capture what actually happened. Let me tell you about Bruceton, Tennessee. Bruceton was home to the Henry I Siegel Company. 3 massive textile plants. 1,700 workers. For generations, families in this small town had a simple, reliable path to middle-class life. Graduate high school, get a job at Siegel, work hard, retire with a pension. The American dream wasn't a fantasy, it was the morning shift. Then NAFTA hit. The layoffs started in the mid-1990s. Slow at first, then faster. The last 55 employees were laid off in 2000. Today those 3 massive plants sit empty. Windows broken. Weeds growing through the parking lots. The downtown bank is gone. The supermarket closed. The clothing store shuttered. Unemployment in Bruceton hit 18%. To survive, workers had to drive to other counties for work, take part-time jobs, accept minimum wage, or simply give up. The town didn't just lose jobs. It lost its reason for existing. And here's what the free trade evangelists never mention. When you lose a factory job paying $39,000 a year with health insurance, you don't get another factory job. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2 out of every 5 displaced manufacturing workers who found new employment took a pay cut. 1 in 4 lost more than 20% of their wages. Think about that for a second. You're 47 years old. You've worked the same job for 20 years. Suddenly you're stocking shelves at Walmart for $15 an hour with no benefits. You lose your house. Your kid drops out of college. Your marriage strains under the financial pressure. And some economist on television tells you this is good for the economy because GDP went up and consumer prices fell by 2%. The cheaper television you can now afford doesn't make up for losing $8,000 a year. Every year. for the rest of your working life. This is the first hidden cost. Job displacement isn't a number on a spreadsheet. It's the systematic destruction of communities sold to you as progress. Okay, so free trade kills jobs. You probably expected that criticism. But here's something almost nobody talks about. Something so absurd it sounds like I'm making it up. Free trade agreements don't actually create free trade. They create the most insanely complicated, expensive, bureaucratic maze in the history of global commerce. Think about it. When politicians say free trade, you imagine goods flowing effortlessly across borders. No tariffs, no barriers, just pure frictionless capitalism. Wrong. Catastrophically, hilariously wrong. Because governments don't actually want complete free trade. They want controlled free trade. They need to make sure that only goods genuinely produced within the agreement get tariff benefits. Otherwise, China could just route everything through Mexico, slap a Made in Mexico sticker on it, and dodge American tariffs entirely. So they created something called rules of origin. And this is where the whole system descends into madness. Let me give you a real example. Under the USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA, here's what you need to do if you want to sell a car duty-free from Mexico to the United States. First, 75% of the vehicle's value must come from North America, up from 62.5% under NAFTA. You need documentation proving this, for every single component. Second, the steel and aluminum must be melted and poured in North America. You need certificates of origin for your metals. Third, between 40 and 45% of the vehicle must be made by workers earning at least $16 per hour. You need payroll records, labor documentation, verification from multiple facilities. Now imagine you're an automotive supply chain manager. You have thousands of parts. Circuit boards from Taiwan. Rubber from Thailand. Plastic components from Malaysia. Every single item needs tracking. You need detailed documentation maintained across multiple suppliers spanning multiple countries. You need specialized software, legal teams, accounting systems, compliance officers. One study found that companies spent an average of $3,000 per shipment just to prove they qualified for tariff benefits under free trade agreements. $3,000 per shipment. Here's the truly absurd part. Some companies just gave up. When the compliance costs exceeded the tariff savings, businesses paid the regular tariff instead. They literally chose to pay taxes rather than navigate the free trade system. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that under USMCA, manufacturers would deliberately avoid using the free trade provisions because the paperwork was too expensive and complicated. Let that sink in. We created trade agreements so Byzantine that businesses prefer paying tariffs over using free trade. Every agreement has different rules. Every product has different thresholds. Small businesses can't afford the lawyers and accountants needed to navigate this mess. Only massive corporations have the resources to play this game. So the second hidden cost is compliance. Free trade agreements don't eliminate barriers, they replace simple tariffs with complex bureaucratic requirements that only benefit the biggest players. Now we're getting to the really uncomfortable part. The part that makes everyone squirm because it exposes the dark heart of how free trade actually works. Free trade agreements give corporations a loaded gun to hold against governments. And once you see this dynamic, you can't unsee it. Here's how it works. When barriers fall and capital can move freely, companies gain the nuclear option. They can threaten to relocate if regulations become too strict or taxes too high. And this threat fundamentally rewrites the rules of democracy. During NAFTA negotiations, researchers found that 15% of employers in manufacturing explicitly threatened to shut down plants when workers tried to unionize. Not subtle hints, direct threats. Vote for the union, we move to Mexico. The mere possibility of relocation was enough to crush labor organizing. This isn't theoretical. In 2002, Stellantis laid off thousands of workers at Warren Truck while the exact same trucks they used to build were being made in Mexico. John Deere is relocating work right now. Mack Trucks too. The pattern is relentless. But it's not just labor. Environmental regulations face the same pressure. There's an entire academic literature on the pollution haven hypothesis, the idea that strict environmental rules drive dirty industries to countries with weaker standards. For years, economists debated whether this actually happened. Recent studies have found clear, statistically significant evidence. Yes, firms facing high environmental compliance costs do relocate to countries with laxer regulations. Now you might think, well, developing countries can just raise their environmental standards. But here's the prisoner's dilemma. If every country raises standards simultaneously, nobody gains competitive advantage. But if your country keeps standards low while others raise theirs, You become the destination for foreign investment. It's a race to the bottom. Not an immediate collapse, but a steady, relentless pressure against raising the bar too high. Free trade agreements sometimes include labor and environmental provisions, but they're mostly theatrical. General principles, cooperation commitments, aspirational language. No teeth. No enforcement. Countries can promise to uphold labor rights while systematically failing to enforce their own laws. What's the penalty? Usually nothing. The result is subtle but devastating. Countries compete not on genuine economic advantages like infrastructure or skilled labor, but on their willingness to tolerate pollution, dangerous working conditions, and poverty wages. So the third hidden cost is the erosion of standards. Free trade creates systemic pressure that makes it politically toxic to protect workers, consumers, and the environment without sacrificing economic competitiveness. Pop quiz. When did you last vote on a trade agreement? Never, right? That's because you don't get to. Trade deals are negotiated behind closed doors by executive branch officials and corporate lobbyists, then presented to legislatures as take-it-or-leave-it packages. But here's the truly Orwellian part. Once signed, these agreements let foreign corporations sue governments for passing laws. Not in domestic courts. In private international tribunals. Let me tell you a story that sounds like dystopian fiction but is completely real. In 2006, Uruguay, a tiny country of 3.4 million people, decided to take on big tobacco. The country had smoking rates of 35% and the government wanted to change that. So they did something radical. They required that 80% of cigarette packages display graphic health warnings. They mandated that each brand could only have one variant to prevent marketing tricks. Philip Morris, with annual revenues of $64 billion, sued Uruguay, which had a total GDP of $32 billion that year. Let me repeat that. The company's revenue was double the country's entire economy. Philip Morris didn't sue in Uruguayan courts. They filed under investor-state dispute settlement provisions in a bilateral investment treaty between Switzerland and Uruguay. The case went to the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, a World Bank tribunal in Washington, D.C. 3 private arbitrators, not elected judges, would decide if Uruguay's anti-smoking law was legal. Philip Morris claimed the health warnings violated their trademark rights and demanded $25 million in compensation. For 6 years, this tiny country had to defend its right to protect public health against one of the world's largest corporations. The legal fees alone nearly bankrupted Uruguay's defense. They had to rely on financial support from Michael Bloomberg's foundation to stay in the fight. Without that help, Uruguay would have been forced to settle or abandon their health regulations. In 2016, after 6 years of litigation, the tribunal finally ruled in Uruguay's favor. Philip Morris lost and had to pay $7 million in legal costs. Public health advocates celebrated. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Philip Morris accomplished their real goal. They sent a message to every other country considering tobacco regulations. We will make you spend 6 years and millions of dollars defending yourself. How many countries can afford that? How many governments looked at Uruguay's ordeal and quietly decided not to implement similar laws? New Zealand delayed their tobacco plain packaging laws for over 2 years specifically because they were watching the Philip Morris cases. That's called regulatory chill. The mere threat of expensive litigation is enough to stop governments from governing. And tobacco is just one example. Foreign corporations have used these provisions to challenge environmental regulations, mining restrictions, public health measures, even minimum wage laws. These cases are decided not by democratic courts but by panels of corporate lawyers who rotate between representing companies and serving as arbitrators. This is the fourth hidden cost. Democratic accountability. Trade agreements embed economic rules into international treaties that constrain governments and limit voters' ability to change course through normal politics. Your elected representatives can pass a law. But if it affects a foreign corporation's profits, that company can bypass your entire legal system and haul your government to a private tribunal. And if they win, taxpayers foot the bill. Let's talk about something you can measure with perfect precision. Carbon dioxide. Free trade increases trade volume. More trade means more transportation. More transportation means more container ships, more cargo planes, more trucks. More greenhouse gases. Ocean shipping alone accounts for roughly 3% of global CO2 emissions. As trade has exploded over 3 decades, shipping emissions have grown proportionally. A single large container ship crossing the Pacific burns through tons of fuel and emits as much pollution as tens of thousands of cars. But transportation is only part of the equation. The bigger issue is what happens when production relocates. When manufacturing moved from the United States to China, emissions didn't disappear. They moved. And often they increased because Chinese factories were less efficient and more polluting than American ones. China's carbon emissions skyrocketed while Western countries pointed to declining domestic emissions and claimed progress on climate goals. But from an atmospheric perspective, it doesn't matter where emissions occur. The planet doesn't care about borders. Studies have found evidence of a pollution haven effect. Dirty industries don't just move to countries with cheaper labor, they move to countries with weaker environmental enforcement. The same goods get produced but with more pollution. The environmental costs extend beyond carbon. Deforestation accelerates as agricultural production expands into protected areas. Overfishing intensifies. Water pollution worsens in regions with limited environmental infrastructure. Free trade agreements sometimes include environmental commitments, but they're usually unenforceable aspirations. Violations rarely trigger meaningful penalties. The environment pays the price while corporations reap the profits. So the fifth hidden cost is environmental degradation. Trade agreements externalize pollution onto communities with no political power to object and future generations who don't get a say. Here's the fundamental lie. The promise that everyone wins. In theory, yes, aggregate wealth increases. Total GDP goes up. But aggregate wealth and actual human welfare are completely different things. GDP can rise while median wages stagnate. Corporate profits can soar while workers see nothing. And that's exactly what happened. Since the 1990s, trade volumes exploded. Corporate profits hit record highs. CEO compensation went stratospheric. But real wages for median workers barely budged. For many, they fell. The benefits of trade liberalization flowed overwhelmingly to capital owners, not workers. Shareholders got rich. Workers got pink slips. What? Because free trade agreements remove barriers to moving goods and money, but not people. Labor cannot freely cross borders the way capital can. This asymmetry tilts the entire playing field. Companies can search globally for the cheapest labor. Workers cannot. They're trapped geographically in declining industrial regions with limited options for retraining or relocation. The result is exactly what you'd expect. Wage stagnation. Rising inequality within countries even as total wealth increases. Free trade creates winners and losers. The winners tend to be mobile, educated, financially sophisticated. The losers tend to be stuck in places like Flint, Youngstown, and Gary. Economic theory acknowledges this. The textbook response is that winners should compensate losers through taxation and redistribution. But politically, this almost never happens at sufficient scale. Trade adjustment assistance programs exist. They're chronically underfunded and reach only a fraction of displaced workers. The compensation mechanisms that would make trade genuinely beneficial for everyone are conveniently forgotten once the deals are signed. So we get the worst possible outcome. We implement trade policies that create massive distributional consequences, then fail to implement the safety nets that would spread the gains fairly. The inequality generated by free trade isn't accidental. It's structural. It's baked into the design. This is the sixth hidden cost. Free trade agreements concentrate gains among those already privileged while dispersing losses among those least able to absorb them. So where does this leave us? Are free trade agreements fundamentally broken? Should we burn the whole system down and return to protectionism? Not exactly. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that makes this whole thing even more complicated. Free trade has genuinely lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Access to global markets has been transformative for countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and parts of China. The economic gains in developing countries are real and significant. The problem isn't trade itself. The problem is how we design the agreements. We optimized for efficiency and corporate profits while treating labor, communities, and the environment as externalities to be dealt with later. If at all. There's a better way. It's not even complicated. Trade agreements could include robust labor protections with real enforcement mechanisms and meaningful penalties for violations. They could mandate environmental standards that prevent races to the bottom. They could include automatic adjustment programs that genuinely support displaced workers with retraining, relocation assistance, and income support. They could preserve policy space for democratic governments to regulate in the public interest without facing corporate lawsuits. None of this is impossible. It's a choice. But it requires acknowledging something deeply uncomfortable. Free trade isn't free. It has costs. Real, measurable, devastating human costs. And pretending otherwise doesn't make those costs disappear. It just ensures they get paid by people with no voice in the decision. The factory worker in Sandusky training his Mexican replacement didn't vote on NAFTA. The garment worker in Bangladesh working 16-hour shifts for poverty wages didn't negotiate the terms. The farmer whose land gets contaminated by industrial pollution didn't sign off on weak environmental standards. But they're all paying the price. So the next time someone tells you a new trade agreement will benefit everyone, ask them one simple question. Who pays the hidden cost? Because somebody always does. And it's rarely the people who negotiated the deal, signed the papers, or profited from the outcome. Free trade agreements aren't failures of economics. They're failures of politics. We know how to make trade work better. We have the tools, the knowledge, the resources. We just haven't mustered the political will to actually do it. And until we do, the costs will keep piling up. In shuttered factories. In devastated communities. In destroyed ecosystems. In workers who did everything right and got crushed anyway. Trade isn't going away. Neither are the agreements that govern it. Global supply chains are too entrenched. Economic integration is too deep. We can't unmake globalization with a magic wand. But maybe it's time we stopped pretending these agreements are free. Maybe it's time we started demanding that the people who profit from them actually pay the price. Maybe it's time we design trade deals that benefit workers, not just shareholders. Communities, not just corporations. The future, not just the quarterly earnings report. The Dixon Ticonderoga workers who trained their replacements and then got laid off are still out there. Some have retired now. Some are working lower-paying jobs. Some never recovered financially. The pencils they made are still being sold in every school in America. Still required on supply lists. Still sharpened by millions of kids every September. But the factory is a parking lot. The jobs are gone. The community is a ghost of what it was. And that's the real cost of free trade. Not the aggregate statistics or the GDP growth or the consumer surplus. But the actual human lives spent in full for a promise that was never going to be kept. Thanks for watching. If this deep dive into the real economics of trade policy opened your eyes, check out the video on how globalization quietly reshaped everything while everyone was distracted by culture wars. I'll see you in the next one.